for me, my biggest number one objective is muscle growth.
Yes.
I'm like in the gym constantly, and I'm taking my creatine, but I've also massively increased my protein intake.
Yeah.
So I want to understand where you are, because this is all, I take rapamycin, so there's this like increased animal protein, working out, rapamycin. So this triangle here, how do you... So it's a Goldilux. Slow it down and explain it to folks who don't understand all those terms, and what do you recommend at the end?
So it's the Goldilux problem. You want to turn it on so you can build muscle.
You want to turn on what?
mTOR.
Okay.
And you also want to give it a break so you can do cleanup and repair. So think about your body has its own recycling cleanup mechanism. It's called autophagy, which means self-eating, self-cannibalism. And it's basically like a little Pac-Man that runs around and gobbles up old proteins and parts. And I mean, think about it, if you're starving, your body still needs to get proteins and it still needs to do stuff and make things. But if you're not eating, what are you going to do? So you basically go around and you recycle all the old parts and you make new stuff, which is basically what your body does. It's brilliant. And the way it does it is through this process called autophagy, which is essential to cleanup, repair, renewal, regeneration. And it also activates all these other longevity pathways, like reducing inflammation, increasing mitochondrial function. So everything you need to do to survive if you're starving so you don't die, it kind of turns it on, which is great. And that's an important thing to do every day. So you can do that by not eating for 12 hours between dinner and breakfast. If you want to go to 14, that's great. So that means eating at 6 at night and having breakfast at 8 in the morning. That's not a hard thing to do, right? Or 10 if you want to do 16 hours. So that's a really simple way every day to induce autophagy. The other is to activate mTOR in the right way, which means not eating all the time, like not eating, bedtime snacks and flooding it with all this stuff. And then eating a big load of protein in the morning when you wake up in a fasted state. And my favorite way to do it, because I don't necessarily want a steak for breakfast, is I have my healthy aging shake, which I talk about in the book Young Forever. Essentially, it's got regeneratively raised goat whey. I sort of use some other pumpkin seed powders, just a little plant proteins in there, and I put in creatine. I put in something called urolithin A, which is an incredible mitophagy compound that comes from pomegranate and helps build muscle, and a few other things like adaptogenic mushrooms and some things from my gut, and I kind of make it like a healthy shake. But basically you've got this 30-40 grams of protein in the morning
to kick you off.
To kick you off. And then having 30 at least per meal. Usually this is the problem with protein. If you look at the data, we say you should eat 0.8 grams per kilo. This is the RDA. Now, that people don't understand what that is. That's the minimum you need to not get protein deficiency. Like, how much vitamin C do you need to not get scurvy? Like 60 milligrams. How much vitamin D do you need to not get rickets? 30 units. Well, how much vitamin D do you need for optimal health? Maybe 2,000, 4,000.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very important to understand what these are. And so particularly when you're older, it actually is important for you to eat more protein because there's something called anabolic resistance, meaning it's harder to build muscle. And the worst thing you can do is not exercise throughout your life and then end up, at 65 being the same weight that you were when you're 25, but you're twice as fat because all your muscles get marbled like a big Wagyu ribeye. And then they're metabolically super unhealthy and drive inflammation, low cortisol, no testosterone.
I'll put a fine point on this. We'll come back to it later on exercise, but the number one correlate between length of life and longevity is your muscle mass.
Absolutely.
Right. And so there's a number of reasons thought. First of all, if you are older and you fall and break your hip or your pelvis, it's like 70% of people over the age of 65 who have that fall die within a year.
Yeah.
It's crazy. My father passed that way.
Terminal cancer, yeah.
It's awful. So you need the muscle mass to be able to hold yourself from falling and having that accident. But also muscle mass is a supply of stem cells and blood volume.
That's where your metabolism is.
And so ultimately you want to maximize your muscle mass. So if you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, go for it. If you're in your 50s, you need to put the time in.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I just want to kind of put a point on this. People say, you can do this with plant proteins. And what I've typically found is that people who are vegan, who are jacked, and I've studied this, they actually eat a lot of processed plant proteins. So they actually have to supplement with plant protein, and you have to eat an enormous amount. I was just in Rwanda and we saw the gorillas. Now gorillas are huge,
and they're vegans.
They're vegans, and they're massive. And I'm like, what do they eat? I was like, what do they eat? They can eat 55 pounds of food a day. They can extract from that plenty of protein.
But they have different digestive systems.
But they have digestive systems are like 10 times longer than ours, huge. And they're big, they have these giant bellies. It's not because they're fat. It's because their intestines are enormous, because it takes forever to digest all this stuff and extract the food. And they have much longer, large intestines where you can start to sort of ferment and break down these foods and start to absorb them. So we have shorter intestines. We have the ability to actually use animal protein, which they don't really. They eat insects, but they're massive. And the key about muscle building is you need a certain amount of a particular amino acid called leucine. Now, leucine is what we call rate-limiting amino acid. It means if you don't have this amino acid, it's hard to turn on muscle synthesis. It's like turning on a light switch. So plant proteins are typically low in leucine. So you can get enough by eating tons of plant protein, but you need like a lot more than you could possibly eat. You're not going to eat 55 pounds of food a day. And so, especially as you get older, you need about the size of your palm, and depending on your, if you're Shaquille O'Neal, if you're a little lady, it's going to be a different palm size of a protein. But basically, you need probably 1.2 to 1.6, even 2 grams per kilo if you want to build muscle and get stronger. And you need to have high leucine protein. Now, you can take plant proteins and supplement with leucine. I call them like jacked up plant proteins, and that's fine if you are a committed vegan, you want to do that. But you can't ignore the fact that you're going to have to eat a lot of these processed proteins, and that meat has carnosine and also creatine and carnitine, which are incredibly helpful compounds that are not in plant proteins.